Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And as everyone said, I will again thank Cleo and Yasmin for inviting us and organizing this. As we know, these are not simple things to organize, so we really appreciate you doing all this. I'll talk a little bit today about another place and time, so temporal variability, specifically focused on temporal variability of places. I will bring up sort of the what I think is, I realize that the point of this talk is the POINT point, but I would sort of wave the flag for us referring to them much more as places of interest rather than points of interest, because we don't sort of, while we work with geometry, we don't exist in the geometric world. But I think that that's a discussion maybe for the breakout rooms if we want to as well. But I think one of the things I really want to focus on is discussing what role time plays in this. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about temporal components today. But a lot of the research that I focus on is really looking at the time that people visit places of interest or go to different types of places. And one of the things I'm quite interested in is how, what does time tell us about differences in the places of interest that we actually go, so the individual instances of places, but also the regions and cultures associated with different places. What does time tell us about these regions? And then lastly, I think increasingly a discussion here as well is this idea of data providers, right? So what does time tell us about different data providers that give us these places or points of interest in this case? So for better or for worse, you know, a lot of us are accessing these places of interest now through our mobile devices. So a lot of them are being generated through sensor-enabled technology, context-aware devices, right? So that means that we're collecting a massive amount of sensor data and contributing an incredible amount of sensor data, right? So this idea of the Web 2.0 or Web 3.0, where we're consuming and producing the same amount of data, possibly producing more than we're actually consuming these days. And what this means is the data we actually collect, the data we actually work with, is this sort of merging of our physical environment, our physical selves, and our digital worlds, right? And we call this digital exhaust. We can also refer to this from a geographic perspective as our sort of digital footprints as we go around, not just the internet, but through our physical world as well. And this idea of digital exhausts contributes to the data that we work in, right? And a lot of companies and government organizations out there have made a lot of money and have built a lot of power based on collecting a lot of this information and using it to drive insight or actionable insight into various different processes and to various different companies and corporations for advertising revenue and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of power in the actual data that we're contributing and collecting, and the temporal component for this is a big part of all of that. Now, one of the things I always talk about here is, and this really comes down to this discussion of providers as well, is the difference between the passive data collection and active data collection, right? So all of our cell phones or mobile phones have, I don't know, 10, 20 sensors on them at this point that are passively collecting data. And so if you have turned on location services associated with Google, for instance, you use Google mobile phone, or sorry, Google Maps, I should say, you are contributing passively information to the Google system, right? We've all read the terms of use and terms of service feverishly as we read through them, and we've all agreed to share our information, share our location information to be collected passively and better understand the environments for better or for worse, one way or another. We also have sort of IoT technology that fits into the passive Internet of Things technology, which is information contributed not necessarily by our mobile devices, but by sensors and various devices around us. And the flip side of this is the active data collection, right? So active data collection is the actual data that we're choosing to share, right? The information that we're choosing to share and actively contribute to whatever service it is that we're choosing to contribute. Increasingly, we look at these as social media applications, and I strongly believe that the term social media sort of masks all level of evil because there's such a variety of applications within that category. But it is something that we're choosing to share this information, right? You turn on your location, you check into a place, you share your thoughts, you share your wishes, your dreams, all that kind of information is actively being shared. And we're choosing to give up that information to a company, government organization, all with the purpose of maybe some social saliency, some social capital or value, or sharing that information with our friends and colleagues. And this is the cost of doing that, the privacy that we're actually choosing to give up by sharing a lot of this information. Now, I can go on a whole separate tangent about privacy of this information. I think that's a super fascinating direction to go down, but I'll just stop it at this point when talking about location privacy, and just remind you to check your privacy settings on your phone every time I give this talk. I like to do that. So this is some of the work many years ago now. Song and Injay will remember this quite well. This is from my dissertation, where we actually took points of interest that were contributed by individuals to Foursquare. This was about 200,000 points of interest in Los Angeles. And we made this application, POI Pulse, which actually showed the pulse of the city as people check in. So this was temporally dynamic in that it showed us transparency of the markers. These are, again, 200,000 different markers. The transparency of the markers demonstrated what types of places were popular when throughout the city. And this gave us the pulse or understanding what the city actually looks like. This was all driven by underlying user-generated, user-contributed content that people are actually choosing to check into and actively contributing to allow us to collect this information. And this was really interesting at the time because we were really quite interested in seeing, well, what does the social media representation of the real world look like? Right. So this, we all tend to trust maps, as we know, but this is not the actual world. This is how people check into places, and it's reflected in a reference map of the world. Right. So we're actually seeing a sort of a social proxy for how people actually interact with the world around us by looking at this. And this is meant to be dynamic, but since I'm doing a PDF right now, it's not actually showing the dynamics of it. But you can start to see if you look around and visit the application. This really led to some of my more recent interest in understanding data cultures. And this is something that has been brought up a couple different ways today in various different presentations. But I think it is something that we need to, as a research community, especially as a POI, places of interest or points of interest community, really reflect on in much greater detail, is the underlying cultures associated with the data that we're actually working with. Right, we've talked about a variety of different applications for working with data, from SafeGraph to Google to Foursquare, Facebook, whatever the case might be. But each of these has their own culture associated with them, be that the people that are contributing the data, how they're collecting the data, what they're doing with that data, and what different types of algorithms, machine learning, neural networks, whatever you want to refer to it as, are they using to actually gain insight from these different data sources. There's a lot of work trying to aggregate these or bring them together. We did some work very early on looking at some of these methods for actually aggregating this data. But I increasingly start to ask myself the question, does it make sense to do a lot of this? Are these data sets so different, and they reflect very different sort of sub-demographics of the population? Does it make sense to actually bring them together, or is this a sort of futile attempt that we as data scientists want to do? I think it's an open question. That's something I'm exploring right now. So if we think about that from a regional perspective, just to sort of step back from my abstract hand waving for a second and think about regional variability. Again, this was older work. This is, again, 6 years ago now, looking back at this when I was putting the slide together, to understand if we look at how different communities interact with places of interest. And again, this is the active check-in, people choosing to check into certain places. And when I say different communities here, I'm being very narrow with my world in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, very major American city-centric. But we still do see differences in the patterns of when people choose to go to places or check into places. What we do find is that about 50% of place types, and this was based on Foursquare check-ins, about 50% of them have regional variability to the patterns, and 50% of them don't, right? So things like drug stores, for instance, or gas stations have very limited regional variability. And that can be really useful if you're a company like Google and you need to index all these, right? You need to have local temporal patterns that you use for determining population or popular times, these sorts of things. How you actually store this information is going to make a big difference, whether you have to index all of it or only index half of it. But it does bring up an interesting point that we think when we talk about with like what Ross first brought up early this morning, which is we're sort of instilling this top-down understanding or hierarchy or category taxonomy of different place types. And it's easy to do that in the United States and compare that. But when we start to actually apply this to other parts of the world, what do these temporal patterns look like? And not just what do they look like, but do they even make sense to understand that, right? Because what we would define as a gastropub in the United States might not even have the conceptual relationship in some other part of the world. We did this early on, thinking back, we looked at Shanghai and we looked at like, I think it was London, it's sort of cities outside of the United States. And there was a lot of categories that just didn't exist in these types of places. So keeping that in mind is important, I think, here as well. But this comes back to the idea that we have different data providers that are contributing different things, right? So this is an example of a single point representation in this place of Google and Foursquare for, I think this is a donut shop in Maryland. And this should be nothing new to a lot of us here, is that there's different geographic or geometric representations of different points of interest, depending on what data provider you're working with. And the big question here is not which one is more accurate, but the question is, what is accuracy in this context? We're trying to put a point coordinate on a polygonal representation and arguably a fuzzy boundary-based polygonal representation of something. Does that even make sense to do that? Is one of these more correct than the other? That's not really even a concept in a lot of cases. But we can start to do this matching, right? So a lot of us have spent some time doing some place matching. This is, again, work many years ago we did, trying to conflate Yelp data and Foursquare, where we looked at topic similarity, we looked at location, category alignment, Levenstein distance and name, phonetic similarity, a lot of different things to actually try and match two different point of interest data sets in Yelp and Foursquare, and did reasonably well for what the purpose of this study was. But again, it started me thinking, these are very different data sets. In a lot of cases, they have the same use case, Yelp and Foursquare, but at the end of the day, they are very different in terms of how their data is collected and some of the purpose of why they're actually collected. More recently, we looked at some of this idea of trying to match places. We looked at Google's Cafe, for instance, and said Google's Cafe is Foursquare's blank. We took about, I think it ended up being about 1 million points in Maryland between Google and Foursquare, and just looked at the co-occurrence of places based on simple geometries like close proximity and very similar name. And I think in our case, we took a Levenstein distance of 0, so they had to be an exact name match and within 100 meters of each other. So this discounted a ton of data, but it meant that we were quite conservative in our approach to get specific matching between coffee shops and cafes, for instance. But as we've seen, there's not a one-to-one relationship in the taxonomies that we find for specific places like Google and Foursquare, which is an interesting finding in and of itself, right? So the understanding of how people define places in terms of categories has been discussed a lot today, but it is worth repeating. And to me, when we start to look at the temporal component, again, I'm sort of jumping over the place, but if we come back to the temporal idea, the temporal component of what we're actually looking at, once we've identified two places as being the same, they are the same place instance, right? A specific hardware store, like a Home Depot in the middle of, I don't know, Baltimore, Maryland. If we look at the Google representation of that, and we look at the Foursquare representation of that, and we map out the temporal patterns, we see very different temporal patterns. And this is not just unique to this case, this is unique to pretty much across the board what we actually see. So this exact same place, when it's collected passively through Google location services, we see a reflection of who's actually checking into this place as being people that are actually in the trades, right? So somebody going to the hardware store or Home Depot or whatever the case may be, this is the person that actually has their phone in their pocket. This is their job. They're showing up first thing when the store opens, 6 or 7 a.m., getting their supplies and then going off and doing the work, which is why we see a decrease in the patterns on Saturday and Sunday. We can see the flip side of that in the active data collection, which is people actually choosing to share their information. They're checking into this place. There's some social saliency associated with it. And for that, we see, Monday through Friday, decreased temporal patterns, but an increase in popularity on Saturday and Sunday. These are your weekend warriors that are, taking a photo at the gardening center and checking in, sharing it with their friends that they're actually at a Home Depot or a hardware store or whatever the case might be. So the bias that's actually underlying this data is quite interesting. We see this in things like schools, right? So this is a primary school, again in Maryland, just giving you an example of it. The passively collected data is an example of, you know, people like teachers or janitors or administrators or school kids that actually have their cell phone on them, where the passive data is being collected that actually shows students there or people there from typical school hours during the week. And we see the active data collection on the other side is when people just check into a specific place, right? So they're checking in. Most people you can see are checking in first thing in the morning when they get there. But this also reflects the underlying sort of human-computer interaction, right? How this was actually designed. Foursquare allows you to check in, which is sort of an instance-based check-in. It's not a continual check-in pattern. Increasingly with Swarm, they've offered some alternatives to that, but it's just an underlying perspective of how the data is actually reflected and stored in what we see. Some more recent work that we've done in this, looking at different patterns across different cities. This is some of the Google visiting behavior data. So Google's I think they call it visit duration. It's associated with the Popular Times data. And we can look at things like family restaurants versus gas stations. And this reflects what I sort of showed before in the active data collection, which is that there is variation in terms of how certain cities respond or interact with certain types of places. Gas stations, for instance, very similar patterns regardless of the time of day or regardless of the city that you're in. So 10 minutes is pretty much the mean, the norm for every city, where family restaurants, for instance, between 4 US cities have very different visit durations in terms of just overall across the entire category. Some of the work that we've delved into that's under review right now is actually comparing these visit durations pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, or I'm hesitant to say post-pandemic. This is obviously during the pandemic here, January 2021. So 1 year apart between January 2020 and January 2021, if we look at duration for how long the average person stays at different types of places, we can look at Los Angeles and Houston. I just pulled them out as examples. For bars, right, we see that people used to spend roughly 90 to 100 minutes at a bar in Los Angeles, and now, so 2 or 3 months ago, people are spending far less time. And again, this just reflects the bars that are now open. It's not reflecting the ones that have been closed, and we don't have that kind of data for it. Similar for coffee shops, right? People used to spend a lot more time at coffee shops. It used to be a much more social atmosphere, and now the average time is about 10 minutes as people show up to get their cup of coffee and leave. So this difference in how we've seen over a longer period of time what that visit duration actually looks like and how that's changed. I'll just summarize today with a few questions, because I think as a symposium, one of the nice things to do in this case is to ask big questions of the community, not necessarily things that have an answer, but are worth sort of kicking off points for having a broader discussion. Some of the broader questions I have is when does temporal variability between POI providers matter? So why would we care if we're using Google or Foursquare? I think that there are some reasons why we would care a lot, and it's important to be aware of those. Should geospatial researchers be spending as much time studying the when as the where? Clearly, I think this is an important thing, and I know Kevin and I have had discussions about this on this being an important topic for geographers and GI scientists as well. And then lastly, sort of a pet project of mine I've been working on for a long time, though, finding time these days is impossible. Is there still interest in a true open POI data set, one where the license is open in similar way to OSM is, but stores information at a hyper local level, things like Wi-Fi password, things like menu items that doesn't fit the OSM model, but could still be stored as linked data back to an OpenStreetMap project. So I have a project, openpoi.org, that I've been working on in my spare time. I'm just curious if people are also interested in that kind of thing. I think that's my time. I'll leave it there. This is my lab. These are my students. They're all good people. Thanks very much.